people are still under the impression that keeping a beautiful marine aquarium such as this one is almost impossible, but we find that having the right equipment and information, it can be very successful and rewarding. Hello and welcome to your Instructional Marine Aquarium Guide. I'm Paul Talbot. I'm going to teach you the little tricks and steps to make sure that you have the right information to keep a beautiful marine aquarium. One thing I've learned about the marine aquarium industry is it's always changing, just like the car industry or the computer industry. When I started, we were just keeping under gravel filters, and then came along canister filters, and then they evolved into trickle filters, and then it got very technical with UV sterilizers and ozonizers and protein skimmers, and now we find that we're starting to evolve back into simplicity once again. What we're trying to do now is keep the aquariums as natural as possible, using live rock as your key filter, with, besides water circulation, very little other filtration, trying to harness the trace elements in the aquarium and keep it as natural as possible. So the aquarium hobby, just like the computer industry or any other industry, is constantly changing. So do what you can to update your information to make sure that your concepts that you're using are currently the most effective. That isn't always the most technical. Each aquarium really does react differently under individual circumstances, because at the end of the day what they are is their own little mini ecosystem, which with time, as you watch and study, you will get to know your aquarium and how it reacts. During this DVD you're going to see a lot of different aquariums, and what you want to do is try and take a lot of those ideas on board for your own advantage and really use the chapters of this DVD to understand the principles of how to keep a beautiful marine aquarium. I'm going to show you some magnificent aquariums and some that are desperately in need of some help. So sit back, relax and enjoy as I unravel the secrets of keeping a truly majestic aquarium. Now this aquarium has about 10 fish in it, and it still looks quite active and busy. The beauty of a reef aquarium is that the fish are not the only focus of the aquarium. In general, the corals are advantageous to the water quality of the aquarium. So if we can use corals as one of the main features of the reef aquarium, we can maintain better water quality without having as many fish. Whereas in a fish-only aquarium, or in an aquarium where there's not many corals, the fish are really the main focus, so therefore we need a lot more fish, much bigger and more impressive fish, to make the aquarium look good. So a large cover of a lot of corals will increase your water quality and increase the focus of the aquarium to the corals themselves, requiring less fish, obtaining better water quality. Now, apart from selecting your aquarium, you also need to select what it is you're going to put in your aquarium. Now there's really three main types of saltwater aquarium. There's a saltwater fish-only aquarium, there's a reef aquarium, and there's an invertebrate aquarium. Understanding which one it is that you want to keep and which equipment and information you need to keep that one is very important. A fish-only aquarium means that there's nothing in the aquarium which is susceptible to copper. So therefore it's very easy to medicate these aquariums, and you tend to run the salt level a little bit lower. There's also an invertebrate aquarium, which means there's not really many fish in the aquarium. The whole target of the aquarium is the corals and the little invertebrates in it, and you tend to run just a few fish, which keep the organic load fairly low, which is also quite easy to maintain. The hardest of the three to maintain is pretty much a reef aquarium. With a reef aquarium, you're trying to combine the high water qualities of an invertebrate aquarium with the higher fish loads of a fish aquarium. The more fish you put in the aquarium, the more waste is produced, and the harder it is to maintain the good water quality for the invertebrates. In a way, you can almost choose how difficult your reef aquarium is to maintain by the amount of fish you put in it. If you have a reef aquarium just with various small fish in it, it'll be a lot easier to maintain than a highly populated aquarium, particularly with large fish. So basically what I'm saying is larger fish produce disproportionately a lot more waste than small fish. So a reef aquarium containing small fish will maintain much better water quality than a reef aquarium supporting larger fish. Keeping an invertebrate aquarium is quite easy because you don't have to deal with the amount of fish waste as a reef aquarium or a fish-only aquarium. So your water quality tends to maintain very high, therefore the corals thrive. On the other hand, a fish aquarium is quite easy because of the various medications that you can use. When selecting your aquarium, the first decision to make is where are you going to put this aquarium. Now in general you'll have a few different options for where you could potentially put your tank. So you need to consider which one is going to be best for the aquarium. You want to try and keep it away from hallways and try and keep it in the coolest position possible. We really want them wherever possible, away from windows or where we're going to experience higher temperatures within the aquarium. You don't just have to get a standard aquarium unit and sit it there like your traditional fish tank anymore. You can make them a part of other furnitures or even set them within walls can look really trendy. But the things we want to consider is how much access do we have to the aquarium and how warm is the temperature. Wherever possible, lower temperature positions are better and making sure there's plenty of access to service the aquarium. These days it's not only a matter of choosing the size of your aquarium, but you also need to choose the style or model of your aquarium with all these all-in-one models that are now available with the filters and lights and everything built into them. Basically understand how many lights has this tank got, how much filtration has it got, and is that going to be suitable for what you want to keep in the tank. So be aware of that before you purchase them. Now when first visualizing and then making decisions on the aquarium you're going to purchase, bear in mind, the longer the aquarium, the wider the aquarium, the better. But then in regards to height, when we start talking about higher aquariums, that's when they start becoming harder to service and generally more expensive. Now, more expensive because the glass becomes thicker, which makes it disproportionately more expensive, and also we're going to need more lighting. If we're going to run a reef aquarium in a tank that's very deep, we're going to have to consider a lot of lighting over the aquarium. Now a lot of lighting over the aquarium also means often a lot of heat over the aquarium. So therefore, more height, more light, more heat, so in general more problems. The lower the aquarium, the easier it is to service and the easier it is to maintain at a lower temperature. Bear in mind when choosing your aquarium that with a reef aquarium, we're trying to get the corals up as close to the light as possible. So we're trying to build a rock structure which is going to allow our corals to be close to the light, particularly our really light dependent corals. So if we're going to get an aquarium that's not very wide and is very high, it's going to be near impossible to actually mount the rocks up on an angle which is going to allow us to get an amount of photosynthetic surface area. Now what photosynthetic surface area is basically how much area has your aquarium got which is able to grow corals. So if your aquarium is not high and it is wide, you're going to have a very good gradient for photosynthetic surface area, which means this coral here easily gets light, that coral there easily gets light, that coral there easily gets light. But then as soon as your photosynthetic surface area goes down, meaning your aquarium goes high and not as wide, your gradient becomes very steep, which means that the coral at the top might do very well and then shadow the corals underneath it. So you're not going to get a good even distribution of light, and the chances are you're not going to have as much light over the aquarium because there's not as much room for the light. You also need to bear this in mind with the double-sided aquariums, because too often I'll see a double-sided tank where the gradient on each side is too steep. only the corals at the top go well, and they really don't get the effects that they were really after because they didn't put enough width to the aquarium. Because if you're going to have a double-sided aquarium, it really is that. You need to have one side and another side to actually allow it to look like a nice thriving coral reef. This is obviously less of an issue with a fish-only aquarium, but with the reef tanks, the angle of that reef is really going to determine the corals that you can keep on that reef. Don't feel you've got to go to the aquarium, see that one, and that's the one you buy or the one you don't buy. Ask about custom-made aquariums because they really can make them to suit whatever it is that you're after, and it really will suit your particular condition. So when choosing a tank, remember that this really is a long-term investment. This is something that you're going to have as a feature of your home for quite some time. So really look at what's available and make sure you choose what it is that's going to suit you and what it is you want to keep in the aquarium. Now with a fish-only aquarium, you've got quite a different approach. With a fish-only aquarium, you tend to have a much higher stock of fish in the aquarium because you don't have the corals and so forth to also maintain interest. With a fish-only aquarium, temperature is not so much of a problem because the fish are more tolerant to higher temperatures than the corals are. The other addition is copper. With a fish-only aquarium, you can easily introduce various medications such as copper to aid any sorts of parasitic problems that occur in your aquarium, therefore making it somewhat easier to look after. The other thing is that phosphate and nitrate, basically lower level wastes, don't tend to be as much of an issue because the fish are not as sensitive to phosphate and nitrate as the corals are. So you can put a much larger load on the aquarium without being so worried about the phosphates and nitrate levels. The phosphates and nitrates will of course cause algae, but providing you have quite a few algae grazing fish and you are prepared to clean the tank with a simple algae magnet, that really shouldn't be too much of a problem. The overall outlook of a reef aquarium versus a fish-only tank is really strikingly different. In most circumstances with a reef tank, people tend to have a whole lot of rock, very busy, lots of corals, lots of rock. On the other hand, with a fish-only tank, they tend to have it a lot more sparse with a higher population of fish and a much more spacious, let's say clean-looking tank. It does tend to require a little bit more maintenance. You do tend to do a bit more glass cleaning and you do tend to have more filtration on the aquarium. With a fish-only tank, filtration is a major key. You're really trying to have as much filtration as you can. On the other hand, with a reef aquarium, the live rock really is such an integral part of your filtration that the filtration you add to the aquarium is really supplementary. With a fish-only tank, filtration is pretty much the bigger the better. The more filtration, the more capacity you have, the more fish you can keep in the tank, and therefore the more interesting the tank tends to be. Water changes are also much more important with a fish-only aquarium. Because you've got a lot more waste being produced, there's a lot more low-level waste that you do need to deal with. So water changes are really the simplest and quickest way of exporting these lower-level organics out of your aquarium. Now once you've decided whether you're going to keep a reef aquarium or a fish-only aquarium, you've really got to consider your options on how to decorate this tank. It's a really good idea to try and grab some books, look on the internet, or go and see as many tanks as you can to try and get some ideas on how you want to decorate your tank. Now as far as a reef tank's concerned, it's pretty simple. You're after trying to create elevation for your corals so you can allow your corals to get up closer to the light. As far as decorating a fish tank's concerned, live rock is still probably the best means of decoration because of its filtrational benefits. But if the live rock just isn't available, go for the tougher rocks, which is the limestone rocks. If that's not available, then you need to consider other options, such as sandstones and volcanic rocks. But wherever possible, go for the calcium carbonate based rocks, which also help the pH of your aquarium, as does shells and dried corals, so you can actually get dead coral pieces which you can use as well to help decorate particularly fish-only aquariums. So look at the options that you've got, and wherever possible go for calcium carbonate based structures because they are the most natural and they do aid in your buffering capacity. When decorating the aquarium, try and be conscious not only of trying not to make too much contact with the substrate, so trying to put the rock on points instead of flat, but also try and make your structure as porous as possible. Try and decorate your rocks so then you're getting plenty of elevation without soliding up and clumping up the rocks and creating dead spots. If we can get our rocks, we can make bridges and structures which allow us to gain elevation without too much mass, allowing better water flow and more caves, good little hidey holes for the fish. If the fish is stressed and it feels open and vulnerable, in general its stress levels will maintain higher. On the other hand, if the fish is able to duck into a dark little cave where it feels safe, you'll find that its stress levels lower much quicker. Now you're really going to have to find out what substrates are actually available to you. There's marble chips, there's aragonite, and traditionally coral sand is the most popular, as well as shell grit. But finding out what ones are available to you is definitely an issue because there's more and more bans on the collection of a lot of these substrates because of environmental impact. So what you're after is a fine layer of a fine substrate. Make sure the substrate's not too fine, otherwise it will tend to collect anaerobic bacteria and will also get blown away with your pumps, because we're really after a good amount of water flow in the aquarium, and if your substrate's too fine, like any sort of sand, which will just get blown away by the pumps. So any 1 to 3 millimeter fine white substrate really looks the most natural. I really find it safest to have a very thin layer of substrate, because the thinner the layer of substrate, the less detritus tends to build up in the substrate. So if you've got a very thick layer that's forming a lot of anaerobic bacteria in the deeper layers, and you've got some fairly big, large rocks in the aquarium, which is lowering the oxygen level within the substrate, you're definitely at risk of hydrogen sulfide, particularly if you move that rock and disturb that coral sand. And this hydrogen sulfide can actually come up into the aquarium. It's a very toxic gas which can actually kill the fish. Some more experienced hobbyists do choose to use the thick sand beds, whether that's run with a plenum or purely a thick sand bed, or even divided substrates where you've got a larger grain of substrate and then a finer grain of substrate on top, often divided by a fly screen. That's fine if you want to use these methods, and they can be used to reduce nitrate, so offering more denitrification, but do take heed to the risks of these sorts of systems. If the anaerobic bacteria is forming because it's starting to choke up with mold, and then you're getting releases of hydrogen sulfide, it can crash your tank. On the other hand, if you are a more experienced person, or you're getting guided by a more experienced person, you can think about using these deeper sand beds for the purpose of reduced nitrate. Live rock is probably the most important part of a reef aquarium. What happens is when you put the live rock into the aquarium, it imports into the aquarium all the different microorganisms which will act like the worms in the compost heap with your natural ecosystem you're trying to create. Basically what the live rock is dead coral. When the coral dies away, what is left is calcium carbonate. The calcium carbonate works like a safe haven for various microorganisms, corals, algae and bacteria. So what's live about the rock is not the calcium carbonate, because that was once a live coral. It's actually the different bacteria which grow within the rock, the microorganisms and corals and algae that grow on the rock. So when you put this live rock into the aquarium, you'll get a multitude of microorganisms: amphipods, copepods, bristol worms, pistol shrimp. These little organisms will run off the rock and eat the excretions of the fish. The fish will also produce ammonia, as will the microorganisms. So on the outside of the rock, you'll get the formation of heterotrophic bacteria, which will break down high level organics, as does the fish's digestive system. You'll also get nitrifying bacteria on the outside of the rock, which are oxidizing your high level waste into low level waste. On the outside of the rock, there's a lot of oxygen present, so therefore you'll get nitrifying bacteria, which mean they're breaking high level waste into low level waste, being nitrate. On the inside, within the porous structure of this rock, you'll form denitrifying bacteria. Now these denitrifying bacteria break your nitrates into nitrogen gas, which just precipitate harmlessly into the atmosphere without odour. When purchasing live rock, what you're really looking for is the shape of the rock. Pay little attention to the colour or what's on the rock, because inevitably that's going to change. So what I'm looking for is good, easy shape, not too many boulders. If you've got a whole tank full of very roundish rocks, you'll find a lot less opportunity to put the coral. On the other hand, if you're going to have rock with a lot more shape to it, it'll be a lot easier to anchor the corals within the rock. It's really important when you're positioning your rock not to lay them flat, because basically your contact with the substrate is going to determine how much detritus you build up in your aquarium. So if it's flat on the bottom, you get a lot of crap building up around the bottom of the rock. On the other hand, if the rock was positioned on points, then the amount of surface area contacting the substrate is much lower, and that's where your detritus builds up. So the garbage doesn't build up around the rock itself, because there should be ample water flow in the aquarium. The garbage builds up at the base of the rock. One excellent tip with aquascaping is the use of a shelf. What the shelf does is minimize your contact with the substrate. So instead of using large boulderish type pieces for your support structure, what you can actually use is this shelf. We will then go mounting the decorative pieces of rock around the shelf, preferably hiding the shelf, and just using this for our support. From the time that you put the rock in, it will go through various colour changes. It will go often through a powder brown stage, which is the diatom phase. It'll often go through a hairy green algae phase, but what you're ultimately aiming for is a coralline algae phase. Now that's signifying that the rock is very well developed and established. The colour of your rock will be very much determined by the water quality of your aquarium. If you have a lot of phosphates and maybe not as high calcium level, your rock may be all hairy green. On the other hand, if your rock is very high in calcium without much phosphate, you'll get a lot more coralline algae growth, which is really what you're aiming for. It is quite wise to use gloves. When handling the live rock, it's not uncommon to find manna shrimp. They'll often pop out and land in the bottom of your box. If you do find them, don't handle them. Use a net and discard of them. Don't put them into the aquarium. Same as most crabs that you find. It's best not to put those crustaceans into the aquarium, because as they grow up, they'll often cause trouble, particularly the mantis shrimp. Though something like 98% of them are absolutely harmless and just good scavengers, there's certainly been cases of them attacking fish, as they are predatory. Once you've got your live rock, it's a really good idea to visualize what it is you're trying to achieve, and then you're ready to put it in the tank. While you're enjoying creating your masterpiece, don't forget to do a tap test, which is simply tap quite firmly on the rock as if you were a large grazing fish, just to make sure that your rocks are secure. This particular aquarium divides a bedroom and a lounge room. It's equipped with metal halide lights, which are responsible for this natural light shimmering effect. There are many different options as far as lighting is concerned. A lot of the time it's not really what's right or what's wrong, it's really what's relevant for the corals that you choose to keep in your aquarium. Now, providing different light sources in the aquarium wouldn't be unlike different positions within the ocean. You've got some corals that come from very shallow water that want very high intensity lighting. Then you've got medium and then deep water corals, which really don't require as much light. So the key is to really know what light it is that you're providing over the aquarium and make sure you consult with your aquarium expert. It's just really important that you know what the requirements of the corals are that you choose to keep. Particularly with large aquariums, what I'll really try and do is offer as much range of lighting as possible. Therefore, you're more likely to be able to keep a more diverse range of corals. For example, if you've got 3 metal halides over your aquarium, don't have 3 of the same metal halide. Maybe have one 20,000 K bulb, one 14,000 K bulb, and one 10,000 K bulb, because you will find that various corals will grow better under the different types of Kelvin ratings. This particular tank has a combination of metal halide and fluorescent tubes. This is a really diverse and popular choice. What a lot of people will do is actually stagger their lights coming on and stagger their lights going off, which not only creates interest, but also simulates the natural sun up, sun down effect. So maybe they'll turn their blue actinics on in the morning, then stagger on the lights during the day until all the lights are on, simulating the middle of the day, then stagger their lights going off, ending with the blue ones going off late at night. As far as lighting duration is concerned, you're really trying to replicate a natural day. So you want to have a maximum of 12 hours of fluorescent light, and then with the metal halides, you're really only trying to run them for about 6 to 8 hours, which is emphasizing the middle of the day when the sun is at its peak. A very overlooked point that a lot of people get trouble with is forgetting to replace their light tubes. It's a really good idea to either document in your logbook when you've purchased your light tubes, or even just write with a texter on the light tube, because with time the lights do lose intensity and spectrum. In general, we try to recommend that we replace the fluorescents every 6 to 9 months, and that we replace the metal halides about every 12 to 18 months. So don't forget, the tubes are losing intensity and losing spectrum. So if you find over a period of time your corals are just not doing as well as they used to, I really recommend replacing the lighting. Particularly with these totally encased hoods, you really need to be conscious of temperature. So try to ventilate this area as much as possible, especially with metal halide lighting. So make sure the metal halide lights are about 30 centimeters off the surface of the water, and make sure they're in a very well ventilated area. This often means that you do need to install exhaust fans to suck out the heat. Now we're going to talk about fish selection. Probably the first key to having a good healthy tank of fish is to start with good healthy fish. When you go to the aquarium, look through the tanks carefully and make sure the fish are healthy. The worst thing you can do is start off with fish that are already sick. Make sure that the fins are clear, the eyes are clear, the fish is well proportioned, and it seems to be swimming properly and comfortable in the water column. Particularly if you're a beginner, I really encourage keeping a wish list. Now what a wish list is when you start the aquarium off, write down all the fish that you'd like to keep into the aquarium and narrow down realistically which ones you're going to be able to have in this tank. Then you can get advice from other people, preferably more experienced, about which ones are the best selection off that wish list. Because you'll quite often create a wish list of 20 fish and find that only 4 or 5 of that wish list are really appropriate for your circumstance. Now what we want to understand is that there is number 1, number 2, and number 3 fish. So you really want your aquarium advisor familiar with these terms. And when you go to buy your fish, or your corals, or your invertebrates for that matter, you want to ask the people, is this easy to keep? Is this a number 1? Can most people keep it? Is this a number 2? Some people can keep it, other people can't keep it. Or is this a number 3? Is this not normally going to work under most circumstances? So it's important to be aware of how hard the fish are to keep before you try to keep the fish. And then if you do want to keep the fish which are number 2s or 3s, maybe have some sort of understanding of what its requirements are, therefore making that fish more likely to work under your circumstance. The next consideration is when to put the fish in. In general, putting the scavenging fish in at the start is a good idea to help keep down your algae and make sure that the aquarium is relatively clean. And knowing that if you put angels in, it's best to put any angels you want in the aquarium in at one time. So the angels go in at one time, so they have equal chance to establish territories. Any tangs you want in at one time, so they have equal time to establish territories. Also with clowns, also with damsels, also with any other group of fish. Generally, the various families are better off introduced in one day. So for an aquarium, you might say, okay, we'll start off with the clownfish, we put the clownfish in, we let them establish themselves in the aquariums. Then a month later, in go the wrasses, we put any wrasses we want. Then in go the angels. So you'll generally have less problems introducing the fish if you introduce the families in groups. So a tang now and then a tang later tends to cause more problems, more friction, more fighting than the same tangs at the same time. There's also a bit of a size of mouth rule. Regardless of how aggressive or peaceful these fish are, if the biggest fish's mouth is big enough to eat the smallest fish, you can usually bet that regardless of what the species of the big fish is, it will normally eat the little fish, because the fish are, after all, opportunists, and if the big one has an opportunity to eat the small one, that will normally happen. So make sure that your smallest fish are well and truly too big to be eaten by your bigger fish. You'll find too it's quite important to understand who the boss of your aquarium is. The boss's job is pretty much to control the other fish and make sure that there's not too much fighting in the aquarium. If your boss is very aggressive and is attacking the other fish in the aquarium, you really need to vote that boss out of parliament. So whether that means removing that fish or even putting something bigger in which might dominate that fish and then suppress its aggression. So watching the aggression of the fish you've got in the aquarium is really important, and remembering that if you get one that's a rogue, you're really better off sending it back to the aquarium shop as opposed to keeping it in your aquarium where you're likely to get ongoing problems. A lot of people suffer from a situation that I call the damsel trap. What the damsel trap is that a lot of people start with hardy, cheap fish like damsels, which really are a good choice to start with because they're so easy to keep, and they do tend to give the novices a good experience in the hobby because the fish are just so hardy. But also a lot of these hardy, cheap fish are also quite aggressive. So don't fall into the damsel trap. What the damsel trap is basically you start off with some hardy fish like damsels, they get very territorial in the aquarium, then you try and introduce other species later on and find that they don't last for very long. And that's because they're getting bullied, harassed, or even purely killed by the damsels. So if you can imagine a new fish trying to get established into the aquarium, it's already got some very aggressive territorial damsels in there, and the new fish becomes almost like a ping pong ball. It goes in, this damsel says, get out of my house. It goes over here, this damsel says, get out of my house. So then the new fish end up ping ponging around the tank. It can't actually establish a territory in the aquarium. It soon becomes stressed. It soon gets white spot or some other sort of problem, and the fish soon dies. Then you try another fish, and then you end up being under the impression that the only fish that work in the aquarium are the ones that you had in the first place. So one option is either take the fish back to the aquarium shop and actually trade them in, or sometimes just rearranging the rocks and disturbing the current territories is enough to allow the new fish to come into the aquarium because the old fish are just disorientated. When you get home from the aquarium shop, your fish will typically be in bags like these. It's best to demand that only one fish goes per bag, because it's quite common for the fish on the way home to be quite stressed and actually beat each other up. If you are going to go for any length of time over an hour or 2 hours before you get home, also insist that the aquarium shop puts some oxygen in with the air which is in the bag. So what you're aiming for is about 1/3 oxygen and the rest cupped air. You don't need anywhere near as much water as you do air in the bag, because the fish don't run out of water, but they do run out of oxygen. Now the next thing you're going to need to do is acclimatise the fish from the water in the bag to the water in the tank. The way that you do that is by floating the fish in the unopened bag for about 15 minutes. The next thing we do is we open up the top of the bag and we roll open the plastic. It's really important that there's plenty of surface area exposed for oxygen. You really don't want to hang the bag over like this, because that chokes off the oxygen supply to the fish and will often kill the fish, particularly if they're left there for any period of time. So it's handy to use a peg, roll open the top of the bag so there's plenty of exposure to oxygen, and then peg it onto the side of the tank to make sure that plenty of oxygen can get into the bag. Once you've had the fish floating for about 15 minutes, what you do is check the pH and salt level and temperature of the water in the bag and make sure that it's the same as the water in the tank. What we then do is we scoop a bit of water out of the tank into the bag and we allow the fish 5 minutes to get used to that. So repeat this approximately 3 times, or until your salt level, temperature and pH are very similar in the aquarium to the bag. Particularly if you're worried about the aggression of your fish towards the new fish that you purchase, it is a good idea to rearrange your rocks and corals a little bit just to disorientate the fish that are currently in the aquarium. This often distracts the fish and make them more worried about where they're going to make their new home. When it's time to release your fish, it's best not to pour the water in the bag into your aquarium, because on the way home the fish will stress and create a fair bit of waste in the water. So once you've discarded of the water, simply net the fish and then release the fish into the aquarium. It's really common when you first introduce a fish to the aquarium for it to hide amongst the rocks and not be particularly active. Particularly fish like wrasses also tend to hide under the sand. Probably the single most overlooked issue with a reef aquarium would be temperature, particularly when you buy your tank in winter and temperature is not so much of a problem. As the warmer months come through, you need to take some action. Now, whether that's simply blowing a fan over your sump, blowing a fan over the top of the tank, opening your lids and removing your hood, or taking the plunge and getting yourself a chiller. The only way that you can really get peace of mind with a reef aquarium is to get yourself a chiller, particularly if you have metal halide lights or totally encased hoods. The maximum temperature of a reef aquarium really needs to aim at 25 degrees. You can get up to 28 degrees and get away with it, but you really need to aim to get it down again as quickly as possible. As soon as you start getting up around 29s and 30s, you really will see significant losses. Now the fish aren't as worried about this, so if you have a fish-only aquarium, providing there's a lot of oxygen in your aquarium, the fish are really not so affected. The fish are really more affected by the lower oxygen, because the higher the temperature goes up, the less oxygen tends to maintain in solution in the water. So if your temperature goes up, make sure there's heaps of oxygen in the aquarium, and you really should get away with it as far as the fish are concerned, unless it was extreme, like up around 34s or 35s. Oxygen will also help save the corals, because if there's a lot of oxygen in the aquarium, you do tend to get better heat dispersal. But as far as the corals are concerned, you really need to aim for them to be 25 degrees. Particularly for small aquariums, what people do in emergencies is keep frozen drink bottles in their freezer and drop them into the aquarium or sump just to help chill the water. Remembering how important it is to keep your temperature down, don't do anything overly extreme. It's better if you do things gradually to allow the temperature to fall slowly, because you don't want an extreme water change with cold water or something like that to drop your temperature because you've panicked and end up giving your fish white spot.